Blood stains, silk much faster than cheap cotton. That was Tessa's first thought when the gunfire erupted, but just 10 minutes earlier, her only concern was not dropping a tray of vintage champagne. She was just a powerless waitress, yet she walked right up to the city's most feared kingpin and asked for a dance. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured, glittering light across the grand ballroom of the St. Regis, illuminating a room thick with wealth, secrets, and suffocating tension. A live jazz orchestra played a smooth, slow rendition of an old standard, the upright bass thumping in time with the erratic beating of Tessa Montgomery's heart. She adjusted the stiff white collar of her uniform, her fingers trembling just enough to make the crystal flutes on her silver tray chime softly against one another. To the oblivious elite mingling around her, she was entirely invisible. A piece of the furniture meant to serve and disappear. But tonight, invisibility was a luxury she could no longer afford. Tessa navigated through the sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos, expertly dodging the drunken sway of Arthur Pendleton, the CEO of a prominent real estate firm, who was currently laughing entirely too loud at a joke made by Judge Harold Reynolds. This was the reality of the city's power structure, a glittering masquerade where lawmakers and lawbreakers drank from the same bottle. And sitting at the absolute epicenter of this corrupt ecosystem, commanding the most secluded and heavily guarded VIP booth in the room, was Victor Moretti. Victor was not a man who needed an introduction, nor was he a man anyone approached without a death wish, dressed in a sharply tailored midnight blue Brioni suit. He possessed a quiet, lethal stillness that made the air around him feel 10 degrees colder. He didn't smile. He didn't mingle. He merely sat back against the velvet upholstery, nursing a glass of amber liquid, his dark eyes cataloguing every movement in the room with the predatory calculation of a wolf watching a flock of oblivious sheep. Surrounding his booth were 4 men who looked entirely out of place among the high society guests, men with broad shoulders, flat expressions, and an unspoken promise of violence. Chief among them was Gabriel Costa, Victor's ruthless underboss, a man whose name alone was enough to make grown men weep. And Gabriel Costa was exactly the reason Tessa was here. Her older brother, Liam, had always been a fool with a taste for quick cash. 2 weeks ago, his foolishness had finally caught up with him. He had borrowed $50,000 from a shadow lender operating under the guise of Oakmont Holdings, a shell company managed directly by Gabriel Costa. Liam had lost it all on a rigged high-stakes poker game, and the deadline for repayment had expired at midnight. Costa's men had already visited their tiny apartment, leaving behind a shattered television, a broken rib for Liam, and a promise that tomorrow they would return for his life. Tessa had spent the last 24 hours desperately trying to secure a loan, begging banks, pawning her late mother's jewelry, and hitting dead ends. This gala was a catering gig she had taken months ago, but when she realized Victor Moretti was on the guest list for this private political fundraiser, a terrifying, desperate plan had formed in her mind. Victor was head of the syndicate. Costa answered to him. If she could just get 3 minutes of Victor's time, if she could somehow appeal to the king directly, she might be able to negotiate a way to pay off the debt without her brother winding up in the East River. Tessa took a deep, shaky breath, the scent of expensive Tom Ford cologne and blooming orchids filling her lungs. The catering captain had specifically warned the staff to avoid the VIP booth unless signaled. Everyone was terrified of the syndicate boss. Yet, As the jazz orchestra transitioned into a haunting, sweeping waltz, Tessa gripped her serving tray tighter and altered her path. She walked past the dessert station, past the laughing politicians, and stepped into the invisible perimeter that separated Victor Moretti from the rest of the world. Instantly, Gabriel Costa stepped forward, his hand slipping instinctively inside his suit jacket. His cold, dead eyes locked onto Tessa, silently commanding her to turn around. Two other guards mirrored the movement, their bodies tensing. The surrounding guests, noticing the sudden shift in atmosphere, fell utterly silent. The laughter died. The clinking of glasses ceased. Even the orchestra seemed to lower its volume, leaving only the slow, melancholic notes of a lone saxophone echoing in the cavernous room. Tessa stopped 3 feet from the table. Her knees felt like water, and the urge to apologize, turn, and run was almost entirely overwhelming. But she pictured Liam's bruised face, and she forced her chin up. She carefully placed her tray on a nearby cocktail table, freeing her hands. Victor Moretti did not reach for a weapon. He didn't even shift his posture. He slowly raised his gaze, his dark, piercing eyes meeting hers. There was no anger in his expression, only a chilling, profound curiosity. Women like her, working class, exhausted, wearing cheap shoes and standard-issue uniforms, did not deliberately walk into his line of fire. Tessa ignored the heavily armed men glaring at her. She focused entirely on the man sitting in the shadows. Swallowing the lump of absolute terror in her throat, she took one final defiant step forward, extended her bare, ungloved hand, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the breathless silence of the ballroom. "Mr. Moretti," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the violent trembling of her soul, "I believe this is a waltz. Would you do me the honor of a dance?" For what felt like an eternity, the ballroom ceased to exist. Time suspended itself in the space between Tessa's extended hand and Victor Moretti's unreadable expression. Gabriel Costa moved to grab her shoulder, a harsh curse forming on his lips. But Victor raised a single, slow finger. The underboss froze instantly, stepping back into the shadows like a reprimanded hound. Victor leaned forward, the dim light catching the sharp, aristocratic lines of his jaw and the faint, pale scar intersecting his left eyebrow. He stared at her extended hand, then slowly traced his gaze up her arm, taking in her fraying cuffs, her flushed cheeks, and the absolute desperate terror blazing in her brown eyes. He had been pitched deals by desperate men, bribed by sweaty politicians, and threatened by hardened killers. But never, in his 34 years of life, had a waitress interrupted a gathering of the city's most powerful elites to ask him for a dance. A slow, dangerous smirk touched the corner of his mouth. "A bold request." Victor's voice was a low, gravelly baritone that sent a shiver straight down Tessa's spine. "Do you make a habit of asking strangers to dance while they are trying to enjoy their bourbon?" "Only when the music is too good to waste," Tessa lied, her hand still suspended in the air. Her muscles burned with the effort of holding steady. Victor set his glass down on the mahogany table. To the collective, silent shock of the hundreds of onlookers, the syndicate boss stood up. He was incredibly tall, towering over Tessa by nearly a foot, broad-shouldered and imposing. He reached out, his large, warm hand enveloping hers. The contrast was stark. His skin was smooth, smelling of expensive soap and danger, while hers were rough from years of hot water and hard labor. "Let us not waste the music, then," he murmured, As he led her toward the center of the room, the crowd literally parted like the Red Sea. Politicians, socialites, and celebrities stepped back, their faces pale, murmuring in hushed, scandalized whispers. Tessa felt 100 eyes burning into her back, but she couldn't focus on them. All she could feel was the heavy, terrifying weight of Victor's hand settling on the small of her waist as they reached the dance floor. He pulled her closer than was strictly proper, his other hand clasping hers against his chest. The orchestra, sensing the gravity of the moment, swelled into the waltz, the tempo picking up slightly. Victor moved with a terrifying grace, guiding her effortlessly across the polished marble floor. "You have exactly 3 minutes before this song ends," Victor said softly, his lips barely an inch from her ear. "And considering my men are currently debating how to dispose of your body, I suggest you tell me exactly what you want." Tessa gasped softly as he spun her, her uniform skirt flaring out. "My name is Tessa Montgomery. My brother is Liam. He owes Oakmont Holdings $50,000. Your man, Gabriel Costa, is going to kill him tomorrow." Victor's expression remained perfectly neutral. "Oakmont is a legitimate venture capital firm. If your brother owes a debt, he should speak to a financial advisor, not ambush me at a charity gala." "We both know Oakmont isn't a venture capital firm," Tessa fired back, surprising herself with her own venom. Adrenaline was finally overriding her fear. "I don't have the money, but I am a licensed accountant. I know how to clean books, how to track offshore accounts. I work 3 catering jobs just to keep a roof over my head, because nobody will hire me without a degree from an Ivy League school. Give me a job. Let me work off my brother's debt. I'll do whatever you need, just spare his life." Victor looked at her, truly looked at her. The cold amusement in his eyes shifted into something sharper, something calculating. "You walked into the lion's den, risking your own life, offering to commit federal felonies for me, all for 50 grand and a brother who sounds like a degenerate gambler." "He's family," Tessa whispered, her voice finally cracking. "He's all I have." Victor pulled her slightly closer, their bodies brushing. "Family is often a fatal weakness, Tessa Montgomery." Before Tessa could respond, a sudden, jarring anomaly caught her peripheral vision. Over Victor's broad shoulder, near the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, stood a sommelier. But something was entirely wrong. He wasn't wearing the standard issue, black slip-resistant shoes. He was wearing heavy combat boots. And as he reached into a hollowed-out wooden wine crate, he didn't pull out a bottle of Pinot Noir. He pulled out a suppressed submachine gun. Time seemed to dilate. Tessa didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds or remember her brother's debt. Pure animal instinct took over. "Get down!" Tessa screamed, dropping all propriety and throwing her entire body weight against Victor's chest. Victor, caught completely off guard by the sudden physical assault from the small woman, stumbled backward, just as a rapid thwip, thwip, thwip cut through the air. The massive crystal chandelier directly above where they had been standing shattered, showering the dance floor with razor-sharp glass. The champagne tower behind them exploded in a spray of foam and shards. Panic instantly consumed the ballroom. Women shrieked, politicians dove beneath tables, and the jazz orchestra dissolved into a cacophony of dropped instruments. Victor hit the marble floor hard, taking the brunt of the fall with Tessa sprawling on top of him. In a fraction of a second, the cold, calculating businessman vanished, replaced by a seasoned survivor of the underworld. He didn't ask questions. He rolled, pinning Tessa beneath him to shield her from the raining glass, his eyes sweeping the room. Gabriel Costa and the security detail had already drawn their weapons, returning fire toward the kitchen doors. The deafening roar of unsilenced handguns echoed off the high ceilings, filling the air with the acrid smell of cordite. "Stay down!" Victor roared over the gunfire, grabbing Tessa by the collar of her uniform and dragging her behind an overturned mahogany banquet table. Bullets chewed through the wood above their heads, showering them with splinters. Tessa was hyperventilating, her hands clamped over her ears, tears streaming down her face. She had asked for a conversation, not a war zone. Victor pulled a sleek silver pistol from an ankle holster, his chest heaving as he checked the chamber. He looked down at the terrified waitress huddled against his side. She had just saved his life. If she hadn't pushed him, his chest would currently be torn to shreds. He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were wide, blazing with adrenaline and a dangerous, undeniable heat. "Can you run in those cheap shoes, Tessa?" he demanded, his voice slicing through her panic. She nodded wildly, unable to speak. "Good," Victor growled, gripping her wrist like a vice. "Because your brother's debt is paid. But you belong to me now. Let's move." Gunfire shattered the remaining crystal above them, raining jagged, sparkling diamonds onto the blood-slicked marble. Tessa scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the floorboards as Victor returned fire. His silver pistol barked twice, precise and deafening, dropping the fake sommelier instantly in a heap of black fabric and spilled wine. But the assault was far from over. Heavy footsteps echoed from the back corridors, signaling more armed men pouring through the catering entrances. "Service elevator!" Tessa screamed, her voice cracking as she pulled desperately on Victor's ruined suit jacket. "Behind the pastry station. It goes directly to the subterranean loading dock on 55th Street. They won't know it's there." Victor didn't waste a single millisecond questioning her. He clamped his large hand around her waist, practically lifting her off her feet as he shoved her forward into the labyrinth of the commercial kitchen. Stainless steel prep tables became their cover as bullets pinged off copper pots and shattered industrial ovens. Tessa sprinted on pure, unadulterated adrenaline, her cheap, slip-resistant shoes sliding on spilled olive oil and shattered porcelain. She navigated the maze blindly, driven by muscle memory from countless exhausting catering shifts, until she slammed her palm against the heavy metal button of the freight elevator. Doors slid open with an agonizingly slow groan. Victor shoved her inside, spinning around to fire 3 more suppressive shots down the hallway, before hitting the basement button with a bloodied knuckle. The heavy doors closed shut, cutting off the chaotic symphony of violence upstairs. Silence slammed into them, heavy and suffocating. Tessa collapsed against the metal wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. Her breath came in ragged, tearing gasps. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in a mixture of dirt, grease, and someone else's blood. Victor stood over her, his chest heaving, his sharp eyes scanning her for bullet holes. Finding none, he ejected the spent magazine from his weapon and slammed a fresh one home. "You know the layout of this building remarkably well, Miss Montgomery." "I work here every weekend," Tessa gasped, pulling her knees to her chest. "I serve people who spend more on a single bottle of champagne than I make in an entire year. You learn the fastest ways to disappear." "You did the exact opposite of disappearing tonight," Victor noted, his baritone voice eerily calm for a man who had just narrowly escaped a coordinated assassination attempt. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek encrypted phone, but the screen was shattered from a bullet graze. He cursed softly in Italian, tossing the useless device onto the floor. The elevator lurched to a halt. The doors opened to a dimly lit concrete loading dock. A sleek, black, armored Mercedes AMG G63 was idling near the exit, standard issue for high-level executives. But the driver was slumped over the steering wheel, a dark pool expanding on the dashboard. Victor cursed again, dragging the deceased driver out and tossing the keys to Tessa. "Get in the passenger seat and keep your head down." Tessa scrambled into the leather interior, the scent of expensive pine and copper filling her nostrils. Victor slid behind the wheel, throwing the massive vehicle into reverse, spinning the tires against the concrete, and tearing out of the garage just as 3 armed men burst into the loading dock. Bullets ricocheted off the bulletproof glass, leaving spiderweb cracks, but the heavy armor held. Victor merged brutally into the late-night traffic on 5th Avenue, pushing the engine to a roaring speed that blurred the neon city lights into streaks of frantic color. Tessa gripped the dashboard, her heart hammering against her ribs. She glanced at the man beside her. His jaw was clenched, his expression unreadable, but his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He was calculating, planning his retaliation. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A safe house," Victor replied coldly. "A penthouse on Park Avenue, registered under a dummy corporation. Nobody knows about it, except my top lieutenants." "Gabriel Costa," Tessa said softly, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Victor shot her a sharp, dangerous look. "Gabriel is my underboss. He will meet us there, and we will find out which one of the Sullivan family decided to declare war on my syndicate tonight." Tessa bit her lower lip. Her analytical mind, the mind of a woman who spent nights poring over complex financial ledgers and offshore tax havens just to understand the people who held her brother's life in their hands, was working in overdrive. Mr. Moretti, the hitmen. They came through the kitchen. The catering staff undergoes background checks for months before a gala like this. They use biometric scanners at the employee entrance. The Sullivans couldn't have just walked in with heavy weapons. Victor gripped the wheel tighter, taking a sharp, illegal turn onto a desolate side street. "What are you implying, Tessa?" "I am implying that whoever let them in had high-level clearance," she said, her voice growing steadier. "Someone bypassed the hotel's security grid. Someone who knew exactly where you were sitting. You don't have a Sullivan problem. You have a rat." Victor didn't answer. He parked the battered Mercedes in an underground private garage beneath a towering glass skyscraper. He killed the engine, turning fully to face her in the dark cabin. His dark eyes searched her face, looking for deception, looking for fear. He found the fear, but he also found an undeniable, piercing intelligence that caught him entirely off guard. "If you are wrong," Victor whispered, leaning closer until she could feel the heat of his breath, "I will let Gabriel handle your brother himself. But if you are right, you might just be the most dangerous woman I have ever met." High above the sleeping city, the Park Avenue penthouse was a fortress of glass, steel, and shadow. Tessa sat on a plush, white leather sofa, shivering despite the thick cashmere blanket Victor had thrown over her shoulders. She watched as he booted up a massive bank of encrypted monitors on a mahogany desk. He moved with the precision of a predator pacing a cage, pouring 2 glasses of Macallan 25 and handing one to her without a word. Footsteps echoed from the private elevator. The heavy steel doors slid open and Gabriel Costa stepped into the penthouse. His suit was rumpled, his face flushed with feigned panic. "Victor," Gabriel breathed, rushing forward. "Thank God." The Sullivans hit 3 of our warehouses downtown while the gala was under attack. It was a coordinated strike. We need to mobilize the entire family and hit them back before dawn. Victor stood by the window, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He didn't turn around. "Is that so, Gabriel? A coordinated strike?" "Yes, boss. They knew our security blind spots," Gabriel said, his eyes briefly flickering toward Tessa with absolute disdain. "Why is the waitress still breathing? She's a liability. Give the word, and I'll toss her off the balcony." Tessa's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to stand up, clutching the cashmere blanket tightly. She walked over to the bank of monitors, glancing at the complex financial spreadsheets Victor had left open. It was the master ledger for Oakmont Holdings. Her eyes scanned the columns of numbers, offshore routing codes, and shell company transfers. Numbers were her language. Numbers never lied. "He's lying," Tessa stated, her voice slicing through the tense silence of the room. Gabriel froze, his hand instinctively dropping toward the holster beneath his jacket. "Excuse me." "You arrogant little rat. I will end you." "Shut up, Gabriel," Victor commanded softly. He finally turned around, his gaze locking onto Tessa. "Explain." Tessa pointed a trembling finger at the glowing screen. "I spent 2 weeks hacking into Oakmont's public filings, trying to find a loophole to save my brother. I memorized your routing structures. Look at column D, the Cayman National Bank transfers. Over the last 4 months, $30 million has been systematically siphoned out of your primary holding accounts and moved into a shadow corporation called Ironclad Logistics." Gabriel's face drained of all color. "She's insane. She's making things up to save her own skin." "Ironclad Logistics," Tessa continued, her voice gaining strength, "is registered in Delaware, but its primary shareholder is a trust fund in Zurich. The signature on the trust fund isn't yours, Mr. Moretti. It matches the digital footprint of a subsidiary owned entirely by Gabriel's cousin, Donovan." Silence stretched to the breaking point. The hum of the city below seemed to fade entirely away. "She's a liar!" Gabriel roared, pulling his weapon, but he was far too slow. Victor moved with a terrifying, blinding speed. Before Gabriel could even raise his barrel, Victor's silver Glock was pressed firmly against the center of his underboss's forehead. The click of the hammer being pulled back echoed like a cannon blast in the quiet penthouse. "30 million, Gabriel," Victor whispered, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "You sold my life to the Sullivans for $30 million and tried to frame them for the hit to cover your tracks." "Victor, please, it was just business," Gabriel stammered, sweat pouring down his pale face. "My business is loyalty," Victor replied smoothly. "And you are officially bankrupt." The suppressed gunshot was a soft, deadly thwip. Gabriel collapsed to the floor, lifeless. Tessa gasped, taking a stumbling step back, her hands covering her mouth. She had grown up poor, desperate, and surrounded by bad men. But witnessing an execution in a high-rise penthouse was a reality she was wholly unprepared for. She expected Victor to turn the gun on her next. She knew too much. She had seen too much. Instead, Victor calmly placed the weapon on the desk. He stepped over Gabriel's body, walking slowly toward Tessa. He reached out, gently pulling her hands away from her face. His thumb brushed against her cheek, wiping away a smudge of ash and dirt. "You didn't just save my life, Tessa," Victor murmured, his dark eyes staring intensely into hers. "You saved my empire. Gabriel was a rot I didn't see spreading. You saw it in 5 minutes." "My brother," Tessa whispered, her entire body shaking. "Your brother's debt is erased. He will wake up tomorrow with a clean slate and a warning never to gamble again," Victor promised. "But you are not going back to serving champagne to corrupt politicians." "What do you want from me?" she asked, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Victor leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, sending a dangerous electric thrill down her spine. "I need an accountant who cannot be bought. I need an advisor who sees what everyone else misses. And I believe I need a partner who isn't afraid to invite the devil to dance." He stepped back, offering his hand to her, just as she had offered hers in the ballroom. It was an invitation to power, to danger, and to a world she could never leave. Tessa looked at the blood on the floor, then at the terrifying, magnetic man standing before her. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his. Did Tessa make the ultimate mistake, or did she just secure her throne in a deadly empire? The underworld rarely forgives, and Victor Moretti definitely never forgets. Drop a like if you want to see how this dangerous waltz ends. Share this story with your friends who love a dark romance twist, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on more thrilling tales. What would you have done in Tessa's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.